Welcome to the Deep Dive. We sift through stacks of sources, articles, research, maybe even your own notes, to pull out the real nuggets of knowledge for you. Today, we're plunging into something that, well, on the surface looks like a bit of a social media spat, but actually digs up this centuries-old philosophical clash about truth, suffering, and how we even know what's real.
Indeed. And our mission today is really to understand the layers here. We'll start with this public open letter about Gabor Maté's work.
Right.
And use that as a springboard, really, into a much bigger conversation about what we consider real or valid.
Okay.
We'll look especially through the lens of a contemporary philosopher, Bernardo Kastrup, his idea of the epistemic compromise and analytical idealism. It gets quite fascinating.
It sounds like this is definitely a deep dive that might challenge how you instinctively think about things like pain or truth or even what it means to be scientific.
Yeah.
Hopefully, you'll leave with a fresh perspective on that tension between, say, personal experience and what the institutions tell us is knowledge and why that actually matters for all of us.
Exactly.
Right. Let's get into it. Let's unpack this.
Right.
We're kicking off with something very current. This controversy around Gabor Maté, especially during his recent tour in Poland. He was in Wrocław, Hodów, Warsaw, Krakow. And he was discussing, various things, including the situation in Gaza, but also his well-known ideas on healing trauma, healing wounds.
Yes, he's a really interesting figure, isn't he? Because for some people, he's this master of working with personal, generational trauma, a real innovator.
Definitely seen that way by many.
But then for others, he's painted as, well, pseudoscientific, or maybe just a popularizer. You know his books, like When the Body Says No?
Oh, yeah. That's a big one. Lots of people encounter that when they start looking into how the body holds emotion, somatic work.
Exactly. And the core of his approach, I think what makes him compelling, is exploring how our environment shapes our psyche. And then, crucially, how that psyche impacts our physical body. Things like inflammation, immune responses, maybe even how easily white blood cells get to certain areas.
So it's not just in the mind.
Not at all, according to Maté. He stresses that humans can't be separated from their psychosocial system. Our brains, our nervous systems, they're not isolated. They're totally integrated with everything around us.
Which leads us neatly to this open letter that sparked the recent fuss. It appeared on Polish social media, Facebook mainly, addressed to Maté from a concerned female scientist.
I saw that.
And it argued, quite directly, that his methods, his certified courses, they just do not stand up scientifically, basically not verifiable by academic standards.
Right.
And it also raised concerns about the way personal mental health issues might be publicly shared, almost like a payment for interacting with him.
Yeah, that comparison to paying with data for social media was quite striking.
Now
look, there are some sensible points in that letter, absolutely, especially about the need for quality and therapeutic relationships, preventing harm, patient safety, proper standards, clear contracts, avoiding abuse or public exposure of very private struggles.
Sure, those are vital concerns in any therapeutic context.
Definitely. The public sharing aspect does raise fair questions, but you also have to see Maté as, well, an innovator. He built his brand over years in a field that wasn't really professionalized when he started out.
Right. The landscape was different then.
Completely. And his main aim doesn't seem to be building rigorous scientific validation necessarily. It feels more like he's exploring, finding ways to help people who are suffering now.
Okay.
What's also tricky, and the letter sort of touches on this, is how the media or event organizers label him, using terms like therapist or psychotherapist.
Ah, when those are regulated terms.
Exactly. In many countries, those titles are protected. Using them loosely is misleading. Maybe the letter should have been aimed more at the publishers or organizers doing that.
That's a really important distinction to make. But what's truly fascinating and where we want to go deeper is that underneath this specific debate, there's this much older, really fundamental conflict. Our source calls it the epistemology of subjectivity. How we know things based on inner experience, that tension between thought and feeling or direct experience.
Yes, what counts as real knowledge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What do we truly value when we're trying to understand human suffering? Okay, so this current debate about Maté is interesting, but like we said, it's just the tip of a very deep iceberg. To really get the grips of it, We need to step back.
Step back in time and also look at contemporary thinkers like Bernardo Kastrup. He's a philosopher, also a computer scientist based in the Netherlands. He offers a really powerful way to understand this.
Kastrup. Okay, what's his key insight here?
Well, Kastrup talks about something crucial he calls the epistemic compromise. Essentially, it was a kind of deal made back in the 17th century.
17th century, so way back.
Way back. It was a response to huge tensions, often violent ones, between religion and the new science that was just emerging.
Right. I mean, scientists were genuinely persecuted, weren't they? Galileo, Bruno.
Absolutely. Tortured, even executed. It was a dangerous time to challenge the established religious worldview with scientific findings. Calling it tension is putting it mildly.
So into this charged atmosphere steps René Descartes. And he proposes a sort of division, right, to calm things down.
Precisely. Descartes suggested splitting reality into two distinct domains. First, res extensa, the extended material world, stuff you can measure, weigh, observe objectively. This, it was agreed, would be the realm of science.
Okay, science gets the physical stuff.
Yes. And then there was res cogitans, the thinking stuff, consciousness, the soul, subjectivity, inner experience. This realm, the deal was, would be managed by religion.
So a neat division of labor, almost.
Kind of. The deal was basically, scientists, you stick to measuring the physical world, don't poke around in subjectivity, consciousness, ultimate causes, and in return, the church will mostly leave you alone. Stop the persecutions.
Wow. And the consequences of that deal, hundreds of years later, they must be huge.
Oh, absolutely profound, because everything that couldn't be easily measured, your private feelings, your suffering, psychological wounds, even your intentions, gradually started being seen as not quite real, at least not in the scientific sense.
So outside the realm of scientific fact.
Exactly. Truth itself increasingly came to mean something that lines up with measurable data, calibrated against agreed-upon norms. It's brilliant for building bridges or computers,
Sure.
but it fundamentally shifted what we consider objectively real. Subjectivity got sidelined.
And there's a really clear example of this that many people might unfortunately recognize. Think about someone, say, a woman with chronic abdominal pain. She goes through all the tests, scans, blood work, everything, and the results come back normal. Medically, objectively, nothing seems wrong.
Right, all the measurable indicators are fine.
But her actual first-person experience is one of intense, real suffering. And that's the gap our source points out. If there's no measurable marker, there's no scientific fact of a problem.
And implicitly, the problem then gets located back onto the person experiencing it.
Yes. Maybe she's oversensitive, or
Yeah.
it's all on her head, or she's psychologically weak.
It's a classic case of the system failing to validate lived experience because it doesn't fit the measurement paradigm. And this connects directly back to Maté, doesn't it? He stepped right into that niche.
Addressing suffering that exists whether or not there's a clear, measurable scientific correlate yet.
Exactly. And look, this isn't just Maté or Kastrup saying this. Many big thinkers have pointed this out. People like Ken Wilber, Evan Thompson, Thomas Metzinger, who wrote The Ego Tunnel.
Ah, yes. Interesting books.
Even going back to Edmund Husserl, they all argue that science can't really grasp experience or consciousness fully until it takes a sort of cleansing step back from that 17th century political deal.
So we need to revisit the foundations.
Kind of, because trying to explain consciousness only by looking at its physical correlates, brain activity, etc., is fundamentally flawed. Those correlates themselves are things we observe through consciousness. It leads to what philosophers call the combination problem.
Combination problem.
Yeah, how do billions of non-conscious physical bits somehow combine to create this unified subjective feeling of being me? It's a huge conceptual hurdle if you start only with matter.
And this sidelining, this sort of degradation of subjective experience, it's had real-world consequences, hasn't it? Especially since the 19th century.
Absolutely. Personal pain, trauma, often it needed to be repackaged into some measurable indicator to be taken seriously officially.
The source gives some stark examples. Homosexuality was listed as a disease in the ICD until, what, 1992?
It's shockingly recent, isn't it?
It really is. And endometriosis, for years, women suffering terribly were often dismissed, told it was hysteria or they were just oversensitive. Why? Because science didn't yet have a clear, measurable explanation.
The knowledge wasn't there, so the experience was invalidated.
And PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, only recognized properly in the DSM in 1980. Before that, soldiers, victims, often just labeled psychologically weak or lacking moral fiber.
Despite immense genuine suffering, it's sobering. It really makes you think, what conditions, what suffering are we dismissing now because our current scientific framework can't easily measure or explain it?
That's a chilling thought.
It is, and it connects to how science is often institutionalized today. As the source notes, it can function more like a validation system, focused on publications, citations, fitting the current paradigm,
Right, ticking the boxes.
rather than a pure exploration system that's actively asking, where might we be fundamentally wrong? This can lead to a kind of cognitive conformism. Meaning the focus shifts from, is this true, where's the error,
Yep.
to what can I say or research that keeps me safely within the accepted boundaries, keeps my funding, my position.
So science as gatekeeper sometimes.
It can be. It acts as an essential ethical guardian and sanitary inspector, which is vital for safety, preventing another thalidomide, for instance.
Of course.
But that guarding role can sometimes stifle the pioneering exploratory spirit. It polices the borders rather than pushing them outwards.
And meanwhile, you have the human reality.
Mm-hmm.
People in crisis are suffering right now.
Exactly.
They can't wait potentially decades for science to officially acknowledge or quantify their pain before seeking help.
No, the need is immediate. And that urgent need is precisely what drives people to look outside the conventional academic or medical routes, towards approaches like Maté's, perhaps, whether or not they come with a neat package of peer-reviewed validation yet.
Okay, so this Cartesian split, this division between measurable stuff and inner experience, seems central to the whole issue. Is there a philosophical way forward, a framework trying to mend this divide? You mentioned analytical idealism earlier, linked to Castro.
Yes, analytical idealism. Our source calls it a very nice approach that engages effectively with other big ideas like panpsychism and materialism. It offers a really different perspective on what reality fundamentally is.
Different how? What's the core idea?
Well, instead of starting with the assumption that physical matter is the ultimate reality and consciousness somehow emerges from it.
Which is the standard materialist view, more or less.
Right. Analytical idealism flips that. It proposes that reality is fundamentally mental or conscious. Matter, space, time, these are seen as appearances within consciousness, not the other way around.
Okay, that's a big shift in perspective. Everything is fundamentally mind or consciousness.
In essence, yes. But here's where it gets really interesting, and our source makes a fascinating comparison. It says analytical idealism isn't just a critique of materialism, it's also like a modern emanation of something that could be called a critique of superficial cinematra.
Right, cinematra. That sounds potentially obscure.
Yeah.
What does that mean, and why is the comparison important? What's the aha moment here?
Okay, so cinematra is an old Buddhist philosophical school, often translated as mind only or consciousness only. The basic idea there is also that reality is fundamentally mind.
So, similar to analytical idealism.
Similar on the surface, but the source uses the word superficial cinematra. The critique, both implicitly in ancient debates and explicitly in Kastrup's modern idealism, is against an understanding where mind is seen almost like a substance, projecting reality outwards from, say, symbolic thought, a kind of mental projectionism.
Ah, so a potentially simplistic version of mind only.
Exactly. Kastrup's analytical idealism and the deeper interpretations of cinematra offer a more nuanced view. It's not just saying it's all in your head in a dismissive, subjective way. It's arguing that consciousness is the ontological primitive, the fundamental ground of being itself, from which the appearance of a physical world arises.
Okay, I think I'm getting that. It's not just my personal mind, but mind with a capital M, perhaps.
You could think of it that way, yes. The underlying reality is mental. So how does this help bridge the Cartesian gap we talked about?
Yes. How does this connect back to the Maté debate and science versus subjective experience?
Well, by positing consciousness as fundamental, analytical idealism tries to overcome that split right at the root. Subjective experience isn't just some weird anomaly or a secondary effect of matter that science struggles to explain.
It's the starting point.
It is the starting point. And therefore, subjective experience isn't merely an object for external objective study. It's also a valid source of knowledge about reality itself.
So introspection, contemplation, our direct lived experience, these become legitimate ways of knowing alongside empirical methods.
Precisely. It's about integrating these different ways of knowing, not having one colonize or dismiss the other, acknowledging they speak different languages, perhaps, but both describe aspects of the same underlying reality.
We need, as the source suggests, new frameworks for knowing, rather than trying to force everything into the single language of objective measurement.
That seems to be the core message, yes.
Right, let's try and synthesize this a bit then. We started with this debate around Gabor Maté, which seems, quite specific, but it's really a symptom, isn't it? A symptom of this deep historical tension about how we define truth, how we validate human experience. A tension shaped way back by that epistemic compromise.
Absolutely. That 17th century agreement to separate the measurable world from subjective consciousness still casts a really long shadow over how we decide what's a real problem or a valid truth today.
And the drive to only really trust what we can measure, it's brought incredible progress, hasn't it? Amazing technology, medicine.
Undeniably, huge benefits.
Yeah.
But, as we've discussed, it comes at a cost. The sidelining, sometimes the outright dismissal of subjective experience, of suffering that doesn't fit the current models.
So true integration, moving forward, it requires real courage, doesn't it?
It does. Courage to acknowledge that different dimensions of reality might need different approaches, different languages. The personal language of introspection, feeling, contemplation.
And the objective language of empirical measurement, testing, data.
Exactly. And instead of assuming one language is inherently superior or trying to translate everything into it, we need to find ways for them to coexist, to inform each other, develop new frameworks that honor both.
Couldn't agree more. And maybe that feeling of discomfort, when your own deeply felt experience, your suffering, your sense of truth, just doesn't quite line up with the official scientific or medical story. Maybe that discomfort is actually a really important signal, a prompt, perhaps, to question the very foundations of how we're defining what's real and what counts as knowledge in the first place.
That's a powerful thought to end on.
What stands out to you listening to this from our deep dive today into how we know what we know?